Amara's fragile body lay under the hiss of ventilators, her small chest rising with machine rhythm. Tubes ran like vines into her arms, while Raven's rough hand gripped the bedside rail. A sterile screen blinked with a single line: cause of injury, fall. The words stabbed like a knife. It was not a fall. It was a blow in a hallway filled with phones. Raven's eyes didn't leave that falsified record. Behind her, memories flickered. The moment a bat gleamed under fluorescent light, the sound of laughter turned cruel, the hush before violence. Somewhere between the silence of hospital walls and the roar of that hallway, the truth had been stolen. A lie had been written into history, reducing her daughter's suffering into bureaucracy. Raven's jaw tightened. The system had chosen its side, and now a mother would choose hers. The hallway of Briarwood High replayed itself in shards of memory and corrupted streams. The roar of sneakers, the smirk of a jacketed boy, the circle of students recording it all. Phones hovered like glowing torches, capturing humiliation in real time. Every giggle, every chant turned into pixels destined for viral shame. Yet those same screens, meant to deepen Amara's degradation, had also immortalized the crime. The weapon wasn't only wood and steel, it was the lens, the silent witness that refused to forget. Even when administrators deleted copies, the echo remained in caches, in whispers, in fragments uploaded before takedowns swept them clean. For Amara, humiliation had been doubled, first in flesh, then in digital replay. But for Raven, those same flashes of red record lights would become her arsenal. What once crushed a child's dignity would fuel the dismantling of an empire built on silence.
In that crowded corridor, one adult's figure lingered like a ghost. Miss Alvarez had seen the bat rise, the circle of students, the trembling girl pinned against cold lockers. She had clutched her lesson plans, frozen, feet refusing to cross the line. Her silence was louder than the students' chants. A single step forward could have altered the moment, but fear shackled her. Later, when Raven would learn of this hesitation, it would sting deeper than the strike itself. Authority existed to protect the vulnerable, yet here, authority had chosen preservation of position. Students learned that silence from adults was a sanction for cruelty. Humiliation doubled, Amara abandoned not just by peers, but by the one whose job was protection. The weight of that absence would echo louder than any word. For Raven, it confirmed the enemy was not just bullies, but the cowardice of institutions. The ambulance carved through Briarwood's sleeping streets, red and blue flashing across silent houses. Inside, paramedics worked in haste, pushing oxygen into fragile lungs. Amara lay motionless, a bruise blooming purple across her temple, her shoulder swollen where bone had slammed into steel. Each bump on the road rattled her stretcher, each second shaved from her life's margin. Outside the hospital gates, Raven's boots struck pavement in hurried steps. Years of battlefield grit hadn't prepared her for this sight. Her daughter fragile, pale, threaded with wires. The emergency doors swallowed her child, leaving her standing against a wall too clean, too white, too detached. But inside her, a different siren wailed, rage, steady as heartbeat. As the monitors beeped with sterile rhythm, Raven's eyes burned with something paramedics could not measure. This night wasn't just an accident scene, it was the first move in a war disguised as protocol.
In the dim light of the ICU, Raven opened the medical chart again. Its cold digital letters glowed with indifference. Cause of injury: fall. Her hand trembled, not from grief, but fury. She had trained officers to spot false entries, to catch lies smuggled in as facts. Now she saw it on her own daughter's file, an erasure disguised as a summary. The words stripped Amara of truth, reducing violence into clumsiness. A fall excused systems, exonerated donors, erased guilt. For Raven, the insult was greater than the injury. Bruises told one story, bureaucracy another. Between them lay a canyon where justice could vanish. Her jaw clenched as memories of soldiers altering reports in war zones resurfaced. She had fought corruption in uniform. She would fight it again as a mother. The chart wasn't just paper. It was a battlefield document. And on this page, her counterattack would begin. The next morning, Briarwood High gleamed in soft sunlight, its glass walls polished as if nothing had cracked beneath. Raven entered the administrative building, her presence unsettling the orderly hum. Principal Marion Pritchard sat behind her desk, posture sharp, words wrapped in calm authority. Raven's request was simple: hallway footage from Block A. The reply was simpler. Cameras were under maintenance. No record existed. The words were delivered like weather, practiced and unyielding. Yet Raven's trained eyes scanned the office. Neatly stacked reports, a digital screen paused mid-log, a nervous assistant lowering her gaze. Maintenance was an excuse, not a fact. Behind Pritchard's half-smile was a shield built for donors, not children. For Raven, the denial was confirmation. The battle was systemic. A principal could rewrite reality with a phrase. A foundation could erase brutality with money. And her daughter's truth was suffocated behind polished glass walls.
Nolan Pierce, once Raven's trainee in discipline drills, now wore the uniform of a school safety officer. His eyes, though loyal, carried hesitation. Raven pressed him silently, and together they examined the school's digital skeleton. There it was, the maintenance log, time-stamped entries declaring cameras offline. Yet just beneath, another reading, a device uptime uninterrupted, humming through the night. Machines did not lie, but people did. The mismatch was quiet proof, a whisper of tampering. Raven's lips pressed into a hard line. One manipulated timestamp was enough to unravel claims of innocence. Pierce shifted uncomfortably, knowing exposure meant risking his badge, but his gaze met Raven's with reluctant resolve. The system wanted silence. Instead, the machines themselves had betrayed their guardians. A single glitch in the logbook was not a mistake. It was the first undeniable crack in the armor of carefully manufactured lies. Hidden away in the third-floor lab, Miss Patel ruled a sanctuary of light and code. Students trusted her as fiercely as they feared her sharp discipline. When Raven entered, tall and uncompromising, Patel rent her face before hearing the words. Without ceremony, she summoned her media club. Desks lit up with keystrokes, screens scrolling with fractured data trails. Each student became a soldier in this new war. Patel's hands rested firm on the desk as commands executed, bypassing takedown notices and crawling archives. Her calm was steel wrapped in silence. Raven watched, her fury tempered by relief. In Patel, she saw not a bureaucrat, but an ally willing to cross lines for truth. This wasn't rebellion, it was restoration. The school might silence cameras, the foundation might delete streams, but in this room, history was being rebuilt bite by bite, and no donor could erase it all.
On glowing screens, fragments of horror reassembled. First a blurred frame, sneakers circling. Then a clearer shot, Amara pressed against cold lockers. Finally, the arc of polished wood descending. Each recovered second told more truth than 1,000 official reports. The students leaned closer, their keystrokes frantic, as though stitching flesh back into memory. Raven's stomach turned, but her eyes never blinked. Every strike that her daughter suffered was now evidence, not just pain. Laughter from bullies echoed in the distorted audio, their cruelty immortalized. Each pixel restored was a thread weaving humiliation back onto the aggressors. They had wanted fame through live streams. They would receive it, but in the frame of infamy. Raven understood then. Justice was not hidden in institutions. It was etched in the devices of children who refused to look away, who recorded cruelty until deletion became impossible. Patel's hands moved with precision, her voice calm as code filled the lab. She set a secure protocol, syncing every restored file to an external node beyond the school's reach. A redundancy chain spread copies across distant servers, invisible to donors, untouchable by administrators. The Foundation's lawyers could spam takedowns all night, but the files now lived outside their empire. Raven watched, realizing this was the difference between protest and permanence. Too often, evidence rotted within the walls of authority. Here, Patel had planted it in soil no storm could flood. Students gathered around, nervous but proud, knowing they had just safeguarded truth against obliteration. It was not enough to recover fragments. The fragments had to survive beyond the shadow of power. In that moment, the balance shifted. What was once humiliation suffered in private halls was about to become a weapon impossible to erase.
At noon, the school's polished corridor filled again with chatter, lockers clanging, students moving in waves. Then the screens flickered. A single image emerged, Chase Whitaker raising his bat, eyes narrowed in cruel delight. Gasps rippled as the clip looped, replaying Amara's collapse again and again. Phones shot upward, recording the broadcast of a crime the administration swore never happened. Laughter turned to silence. Silence turned to outrage. For the first time, humiliation shifted sides. Chase's arrogance, once untouchable, now stood on repeat, dissected by every angle, immortalized across every student feed. Principal Pritchard's face drained of color as she entered the hallway, surrounded by students who no longer believed her reports. Truth no longer needed courtrooms. It blazed from school monitors. The bully's fame had finally arrived, but it was dressed in infamy, wrapped in looping evidence he could never undo. Halverson stood in the corridor, sweat shining under fluorescent light, insisting that what students saw was fabricated. But the lab had prepared more than video. A second clip rolled, audio of his own voice urging the team manager to move quickly, caught by a hidden camera. The hallway erupted in gasps, then shouts. Authority collapsed in real time. Students no longer whispered, they screamed, "Justice for Amara." Phones zoomed close on Halverson's trembling face, his denials drowned by their chants. Raven stood silent in the crowd, letting the humiliation spread naturally. This was no private confrontation, it was public execution by evidence. Every lie stacked over weeks unraveled in seconds. Halverson's reputation, once cushioned by obedience, now lay shredded across live streams. His attempt at denial became fuel for his downfall. In front of hundreds of students, the protector of rules had been exposed as a conspirator of silence.
The energy in Block A thickened into something irreversible. Students who once filmed for entertainment now streamed for justice. The chants rose, echoing against lockers, drowning authorities' attempts at control. Raven felt the shift in the air. It was no longer her battle alone. Amara's humiliation had become a shared wound, and every student carried a fragment of it in their phones. Pritchard's polished image cracked as she tried to force calm, her voice lost in the storm. Fear spread through the staff, but exhilaration coursed through the students. They had witnessed cruelty. Now they demanded accountability. The tide of humiliation surged, rolling from one bully to every adult who had enabled them. For Raven, it was vindication. What had been meant to isolate her daughter now united an entire school. In the roar of the crowd, power shifted. Silence had been broken. In the lab, Patel's students printed out sheets of cold data. Lines of numbers, server logs, and digital pathways pointed to a single origin, the county board office. Every takedown request traced back to that address, the heart of institutional power. Raven examined the black and white proof, her eyes narrowing. This wasn't just teenage cruelty, it was adult machinery grinding truth into dust. Students stared at the logs in disbelief, realizing the cover-up was bigger than their classrooms. Patel handed the papers to Raven, steady, silent, resolute. The humiliation no longer belonged only to Chase Whitaker. It extended to his father's board, the donors who wrapped themselves in respectability. By tying their servers to censorship, they had left fingerprints across the crime. In exposing those lines of code, Raven had pulled the mask from the very architects of silence. The storm now reached upward. Marion Pritchard stood in the center of the storm, her smile brittle, her hands tight around a useless report. Around her, students streamed proof, parents whispered in outrage, and Raven stepped forward with papers that bore the weight of undeniable truth. The polished office glass no longer shielded her authority. It reflected only fear. Once she had been untouchable, backed by donors and silence. Now, with every second, her denials rang hollower. Students jeered, parents demanded answers, phones recorded her every twitch. Authority, once seated firmly in her posture, dissolved into a cage of exposure. For Raven, watching this unravel was more satisfying than confrontation. Humiliation needed no words. It lived in the cracks of Pritchard's composure, in the crowd's growing fury, in the way silence had finally turned against her. The principal was no longer an authority figure. She was a prisoner of her own lies. In a quiet moment away from the chance, Pierce handed Raven the tampered logs. His eyes betrayed fear, but his loyalty to truth outweighed the risk. The papers carried timestamps that didn't align, proof of manipulation. Raven folded them carefully, each page a weapon sharper than steel. This wasn't just evidence, it was chain of custody, clean and undeniable. For years, she had trained men to recognize the importance of documentation, to win wars not only on fields, but in reports. Now that discipline armed her again. The system had tried to bury Amara's suffering under paperwork. Raven would use paperwork to exhume it. Humiliation would come not only through viral clips and public outrage, but through the cold precision of files that left no escape. Authority had chosen paper to disguise the truth. Paper would now be the blade that cut it down.
The board chamber buzzed under fluorescent light, heavy with the presence of reporters, parents, and restless students. At the oval table sat the trustees, faces lined with tension, eyes shifting from Raven to Pritchard. Cameras clicked, capturing every strained breath. This was no ordinary session. It was a tribunal of power. Raven stood tall, the weight of evidence in her bag, the silence of hundreds waiting behind her. Once, these rooms had suffocated complaints with procedure. Tonight, they were suffocated by expectation. Pritchard sat rigid, whispering to her allies, clinging to her dwindling shield. Pierce watched from the side, steady, but grim. The donor's influence hung in the air like a stench, but Raven had prepared for this moment with precision. Humiliation would not be delivered in anger. It would be administered in sequence, each piece of truth stripping away the pretense of authority, leaving only exposure. The room silenced as Raven placed 3 objects on the table. First, the restored video, images no denial could erase. Second, the tampered logs, black and white proof of fraud. Third, a transparent evidence bag containing the bat itself, recovered under protocol. Each piece landed with the weight of inevitability. Parents leaned forward, students streamed, reporters scribbled furiously. Raven did not need to speak. The objects spoke for her. Together, they formed a chain stronger than any rhetoric. Each link tied humiliation directly to those who had tried to bury truth. For Pritchard, the sight was devastating. Every denial she had rehearsed collapsed beneath tangible proof. For the board, silence spread. They were no longer decision makers. They were witnesses at an execution of reputation. In those 3 simple artifacts, Raven had reduced months of lies into a chain of exposure impossible to deny.
The evidence bag gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Pierce held up the bat. Students and parents gasped as they saw the smear of orange paint streaking its polished surface. Locker paint. Locker A17, the very spot where Amara's head had struck. It was proof not spoken in words, but etched in matter. Paint did not lie. Unlike statements, it did not bend. The streak bridged victim and weapon, sealing the truth in undeniable chemistry. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising through the chamber. Students watching the live stream exploded with commentary. The humiliation spread instantly. What had been denied for weeks was proven in color. Chase's cruelty was branded forever on wood and steel, and the school's attempt to call it a fall now looked absurd. The bat no longer belonged to athletes, it belonged to history, carrying shame in every scratched fiber. Halverson, pale and sweating, clutched at the arms of his chair. His voice cracked under the weight of exposure. The logs were undeniable, the audio damning, the bat irrefutable. Finally, fear shattered his composure. Words spilled from him like confession. He had acted under orders. Pritchard had instructed him to secure donor property. He was merely the hand, not the mind. The chamber erupted in gasps, parents rising to their feet, students pressing closer to their screens. Pritchard's mask froze, her authority crumbling in real time. For Raven, the moment was a pinnacle. Humiliation had eaten through the ranks, devouring the chain of silence from bottom to top. Halverson thought confession might save him. Instead, it sealed his disgrace. Authority meant to protect had chosen obedience to power. Now, in one trembling voice, it admitted complicity before the world. Exposure had become inescapable.
The board chamber dissolved into chaos. Parents shouted, pointing at administrators. Students in the back lifted phones high, capturing every second. Outside, chants grew louder as protesters pressed against glass, their voices echoing inside. Humiliation was no longer an abstract word. It was a storm shaking the very walls. The officials scrambled to preserve order, but no one listened. Every lie spoken weeks before now played back in real time against their faces. Reporters fed the frenzy, their flashes capturing the downfall of the powerful. Raven stood still, unflinching, letting the storm rage around her. She had no need to fuel it. The evidence had done its work. Pritchard sat frozen, lips tight, reputation shredded. The tide had turned fully. Authority was not in the board's hands. It was in the roar of the crowd, in the phones of the young, in humiliation that refused to die. When the board threatened to withhold funding unless order was restored, a new voice cut through the chamber. Local business leaders rose from the back rows, their statements clear. They would provide the resources the community needed if accountability was delivered. Gasps rippled through the audience. The weapon of donor control, wielded for decades, had been blunted in seconds. The humiliation for the Whitaker family was total. Their wealth, once synonymous with protection, was now disposable, replaceable. Phones lit up with the announcement, spreading faster than any decree. Raven's chest rose with steady satisfaction. For the first time, the board realized they had no leverage. Money had always been their shield. Now it was stripped away. Humiliation didn't just strike individuals, it crippled structures. The Whitakers' control collapsed. Their prestige burned in public view. In that chamber, power shifted permanently, built not on wealth, but on truth.
The board chair, trembling under the combined weight of outrage and evidence, announced the suspension of Principal Pritchard. The words hung heavy, carried instantly through cameras and phones into every home. Pritchard sat rigid, her once pristine authority shattering under the gaze of hundreds. Students erupted in cheers, parents cried out in vindication, and Raven stood still, her expression unflinching. This was not triumph, it was the first strike of justice landing clean. For Pritchard, the humiliation was surgical. Stripped of her position, she faced the very children she had abandoned. No polished speech could erase the spectacle of her downfall. Reporters leaned in, catching every detail of her collapse. Once, her name had commanded respect. Now it commanded disgrace. The suspension was not just a punishment, it was a public branding, sealing her place in the history of shame carved into Briarwood's legacy. In a closed interrogation, cameras rolled as Chase Whitaker slouched in his chair, arrogance cracked under pressure. His words slipped, soft but deadly. "Sponsor will cover it." The room froze. Phones didn't need to stream this. Word of his phrase spread like wildfire, igniting the final confirmation. This wasn't just a bully. This was an heir speaking with entitlement, believing corruption eternal. Now those very words were evidence. For the Whitaker family, humiliation was complete. They had hidden behind lawyers, behind donations, behind influence, yet their own son had betrayed the script. Students replayed the phrase in whispers. Parents shared it across group chats. Reporters etched it into headlines. "Sponsor will cover it" became synonymous with cowardice. For Raven, the moment was sharp relief. The empire had not been toppled by force. It had been punctured by arrogance, leaking disgrace until collapse was inevitable.
Back in the sterile silence of the ICU, Raven returned to Amara's bedside. Machines beeped steadily, their rhythm both comforting and cruel. Her hand brushed the bandaged forehead, her grip firm on the fragile fingers resting in hers. The battle outside had shaken a system, but the war that mattered most lay in this bed. Every moment was suspended, a mother's heart synchronized with the pulse on a monitor. The room carried the smell of antiseptic, the hum of vents, the weight of waiting. Raven allowed herself no tears. She had fought for soldiers in deserts, defended men in hostile streets, but this vigil was her fiercest station. Amara's body bore the proof of brutality, yet her chest still rose with life. Here in the sterile glow, Raven's fight distilled to its essence, a mother holding vigil for truth, love, and the hope of awakening. The moment came without warning. A faint twitch fluttered beneath Amara's eyelids. Her lips parted, a weak breath slipping through, followed by the slow effort of words unformed. Machines registered the shift, alarms soft but steady. Raven leaned closer, her grip unyielding, her heart tightening against the impossible mix of relief and fear. Amara's eyes opened, glassy but alive, staring at the ceiling light above. For weeks she had been silent, her body a battlefield of scars. Now, fragile and broken, she had returned. The awakening rippled outward, first through Raven's clenched breath, then through the staff who whispered in disbelief. In that moment, humiliation inverted again. Those who had tried to bury the girl's story were forced to face her survival. She was no longer a victim in a file. She was living proof that truth refused to die no matter how deep buried.
Amara's voice was faint, halting, but her words carried the weight of a blade. Through fractured breath, she remembered the moment of chaos. The last sound before blackness was not the crack of wood, but the chant of a girl, Haley Prescott, screaming, "Go live!" The words ignited the crowd, instructing peers to record cruelty as entertainment. Now, in the sterile silence of ICU, those words became evidence, proof that humiliation was not accidental but orchestrated. The bully clique had not only beaten her, they had staged her suffering for an audience. Raven's jaw clenched, eyes burning with a final flame of fury. Phones that once amplified cruelty had now preserved the command that damned them. Haley's reputation, once adorned with clout, was reduced to ash. Her voice, captured in memory and echoed by Amara's awakening, would forever ring as the anthem of orchestrated humiliation. Weeks later, the hallway gleamed with fresh paint, yet one section stood transformed. A steel plaque had been mounted on the wall above locker A17, engraved with solemn words. The day Amara fell, the day justice stood up. Beneath glass, sealed forever, lay a sliver of orange paint streaked with dried blood. Students paused as they walked past, phones rising once more, but this time to record remembrance. The hallway that had once echoed with cruelty now whispered of justice. For Chase, for Haley, for Pritchard, humiliation was permanent. Their names were not etched on the plaque, yet every whisper tied them to it. Wealth, silence, denial, all had failed to erase the scar. The school had chosen to immortalize it. In that steel and paint, humiliation had transcended scandal. It had become history, a permanent scar carved into the institution that once denied it.
The plaque was only the beginning. Across Briarwood, new protocols spread. Cameras functional, hotlines anonymous, parent oversight embedded in policy. They called it the Amara Initiative. It was not just reform, it was a revolution seeded by humiliation and watered with exposure. For families, it meant safety. For staff, it meant accountability. For bullies, it meant fear of consequence. The community embraced it, their unity replacing the donor's shadow. Where once wealth dictated silence, now collective vigilance dictated truth. For Raven, it was not victory, but continuity. Systems could never erase cruelty entirely, but they could be forced to face it. Amara's suffering had birthed safeguards that would outlast names, donors, and administrations. In the ripple of this initiative, humiliation became transformation, reshaping a fractured school into a fortress of vigilance. The price had been unbearable, but the legacy stretched far beyond a single hallway. The camera pulled back through the polished glass windows of Briarwood, rising into the evening sky. Across the city, schools unveiled similar plaques, each marked with white flags fluttering under the name Amara Initiative. What had begun as cruelty in one hallway had become a movement engraved into an entire district. The Whitaker name, once synonymous with prestige, was now whispered as a curse, their fortune powerless against history. The bullies lived beneath a shadow they could never shake, their humiliation eternal. For Raven, the sky above was no longer suffocating. It stretched wide, open, a silent acknowledgement of her war fought and won without surrender. The legacy of humiliation had outgrown her grief, turning into armor for countless others. From ICU walls to classroom corridors, Amara's name now stood as proof that even buried truth could rise and blaze across the sky.